Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 116. This is for our class for Monday, the 2nd of December, where we are moving forward with poetry, and I am moving forward with catching up with your discussion forum responses. And in terms of poetry, we saw Dead Poets Society, which I thought would be a good film for us to grapple with the question of what is poetry. And there is no simple answer to that, as our textbook talks about. Though Mr. Keating, the teacher in the film, which is a play on the famous romantic poet John Keats, the teacher's name is John Keating, talks about humorously that the purpose of poetry is to woo women. Perhaps there is a certain level of truth to that, especially in some of the more older and traditional poems. That's part of the joke. The Dead Poets Society film does a good job, I think, of mixing humor with seriousness and with tragedy. Obviously, the tragic suicide of Neil Perry. And of course, there have been lots of speculations about the real reason for the suicide. Could have been more than just a father denying his son access to acting in a play that I hope sounded familiar to you, Midsummer Night's Dream. Some of the speculation has surrounded Neil and Todd's relationship as roommates. Could there be more than a friendship there, some sort of homoerotic tension? Suppose there could be. That said, the film focuses less on sexual identity and more on the idea of being able to balance independence and choosing one's own path, but also to do so in a cautious manner. Hence, the idea of taking a phone call from God in a school meeting where you're being reprimanded is not necessarily in one's best interest, as Mr. Keating says. He jokes that perhaps a collect call would have been funny. If you are familiar with payphones, then you know that prior to the days of cell phones, were the ways that you would make a phone call in public and you would put money into the payphone. And if you didn't have money, well, what you would do is call an operator, and the operator would connect you with the party to whom you wish to speak and would ask if that party would be willing to accept the charges for the phone call. That's a collect call, in case you missed the humor of that. And we see at the very ending of the film how about half of the class has understood the lesson that Keating was giving about the importance of taking risk, but to do so in a way that isn't going to necessarily destroy oneself in the way that Neil Perry does, certainly. And if we think a little bit about one of the messages of Dead Poets Society in the very famous poem that Mr. Keating quotes, The Road Not Taken, where he quotes the very famous line, "Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and I took the one less traveled by. That has made all the difference." I can tell you that is an incredibly misunderstood poem. And usually, and we will be reading this poem in class, usually the way it's viewed is a celebration of independence, but the title of the poem, The Road Not Taken, suggests that it's not about the choice made, but about the choice not made, and the sense of regret or perhaps longing, or if nothing else, curiosity. So again, there are shades to being independent and living in a carpe diem kind of philosophy. But just to reiterate, and some of the textbook readings are not available online, so unfortunately, I've given you the page numbers for those. They are copyright protected. Usually they're commentaries from the editors. There's also a copy of the book on reserve in the GCC library, if you so wanted to consult with that. And this is what I'm going to be covering today until we actually get to some of the poems themselves. And luckily, I was able to find links online so I can direct you to that. Basically, there is no clear definition to poetry. Usually, we think of poetry as having some kind of rhyme, some kind of meter, some kind of alliteration. Rhyme is when the endings of the words sound the same. Meter is when you've got some sort of a beat. And alliteration is when the beginnings of the words sound the same. In other words, poetry is quite musical. And if you're familiar with music lyrics, then you know that some of them can be quite poetic. Some of them can be very superficial as well. But Really good music lyrics are basically poetry that incorporate singing and the musical instruments so that we can hear the musicality. Imagine if you were to strip away the singing and strip away the musical instruments. And that's really what you get with poetry. Expect it to be dense and compact. The good news is that it's shorter than the dramas we've read, but it will be highly compact. So you're going to need to read multiple times. And while I've been saying this all semester long, it's especially important with poetry. And the shorter the poem, probably the more attention you have to pay to it. And oftentimes there's an examination of emotional states. I think about how difficult it is to articulate an emotion. You can look it up in the dictionary, but the definition is rather flat for love or happiness or fear or hate. And poetry tries to articulate in words those feelings. And some poets, for instance, Emily Dickinson, are quite skilled at being able to do so. Do read the poetry out loud. Listen for the sound, the musicality. Some of the poems that we will be reading over the course of the semester, the links include either professional readers reading the poems, oftentimes they're actors, or they include the actual poets themselves if they're contemporary enough reading their poetry. And sometimes the poets are very skilled at reading their poetry, and sometimes they're not. Just like sometimes songwriters are very skilled at singing their songs, and sometimes they're not. So, there is a list of suggestions for approaching poetry, at least in the edition that I ordered for you in class on page 606 to 607. Good news is that many of those suggestions are similar to suggestions that we've talked about over the course of the semester. For instance, assume you have to read it more than once. Pay attention to the title. When you read for the first time, don't try to become entangled in understanding it. Just appreciate the sound. Then the second reading, you can begin to try to interpret it. And then the third reading to refresh your memory. Look up any words and passages you don't know, which is always a good idea, but especially with poetry, because it is so short and it is so condensed. Read for punctuation. And expect that poetry is going to violate a lot of the rules of mechanics that we're used to when we're writing. So poems don't need to be written in complete sentences. They can be written in fragments. And a line doesn't have to go from one end of the margin to the other. It can stop in midline, and then the poet can decide to start a new line. It could be the signal of a new sentence, but it could also be in mid-sentence. And we have to ask ourselves why the poet made these decisions for all of these choices. Basically, poetry looks like a staggered line of text, as opposed to when we talk about sentences or prose, where basically you've got one line that goes from one end of the margin to the other, as opposed to the staggered line. So a lot of poetry is visual, is what makes it poetry. And paraphrase the poem. Try to put it in your own language, if at all possible. Explicate the poem, which sounds like explain. And explicating a poem is basically reading it line by line, word for word, piece of punctuation by piece of punctuation. So try to understand how and why those pieces are important. Assume every element in the poem has a purpose, though you may not necessarily be able to identify those purposes. Don't expect a definitive reading. You can come up with multiplicities of possibility. That's something we've talked about all semester long, about different ways to interpret, depending on the lens or the critical approach you use, which gets us back to the beginning of the semester. And you can apply those critical strategies, whether reading from a biographical perspective or historical perspective, or any of the other perspectives. You can apply that to poetry. And in terms of writing about poetry, again, the good news is that it's very similar to many of the suggestions that you have heard before for writing about drama or writing about short story. Thinking about who's the speaker. Sometimes it's easy to identify who a speaker is in a poem. Sometimes it's not. How do you respond to the speaker? What is the setting, the time, and the place? If we're given that information, sometimes we are, sometimes we aren't. The theme or themes of the poem. How does the diction or the use of language, how does that help reveal the poem's meaning? Are any words repeated? Are there any puns or any forms of wit or figures of speech or symbols? Is irony used, and if so, how? What is the tone of the poem? Are there sounds repeated? Is there a beat that's repeated? Um, does the overall structure of the poem follow a pattern or not? Um, so all of these things that you can think about, this is on for us when we're talking about writing about poetry. Um, it's very similar to approaches for poetry. And you can see that in the text that I had ordered, that would be on page 627 to 629 about writing about poetry. And I wanted to talk a little bit about scanning a poem. Now, you can go through a poem and identify the way that it is put together in terms of patterns of sound, that would be rhyme, or in terms of patterns of beat, and that would be meter. Much like you could go through a sentence if you felt like it. And what we call it is diagramming a sentence. When you go through a sentence and you identify the parts of speech, the nouns and the verbs and the prepositions. And it's useful to understand how a sentence is put together, just like it's useful to know how a poem is put together. But the question is, I suppose, so what? That, yes, you can identify a sentence and let's say a short story that has 2 nouns and 3 verbs. And 4 pronouns, but so what? How or why is that important in our understanding the text? And if you can't come up with an argument, then it's not really worth discussing. Unless you can't come up with an argument. Perhaps you want to argue that the pronoun I is used 37 times in a piece, and that the central character is very self-centered and egocentric, hence the use of the I. Now, that's a way of talking about how the grammatical structure of the piece is reinforcing what the theme or themes are in the piece. You can do the same with poetry. And we're given 2 poems. Luckily, I was able to find links for this. This is in the scanning poems section in the notes below. And one is called Waiting for the Storm. This is on page 760. And at least in the version that I ordered for you. And if you are looking at it with the online link, then you're not going to see how the poem has been scanned, because you can basically take a poem and divide it up into syllables and accented and unaccented elements. And this is what you're going to see in your textbook with a lot of little marks on it. And I can read the poem to you. It was written in 1986 by Timothy Steele, Waiting for the Storm. And it's divided into 2 sections. And in fact, if you see that, where a poem is divided into sections, it almost looks like paragraphs. There's a term for that in poetry. It's called stanza. So these are the 2 stanzas of the poem. Breeze sent a wrinkling darkness across the bay. I knelt beneath an upturned boat, and moment by moment felt the sand in my feet grow colder, the damp air chill and spread. Then the first raindrops sounded on the hull above my head. And if we were to read and reread this poem, we would realize that there's a breeze that's sending our darkness across the bay. So this person is by the water. And they're kneeling beneath an upturned boat. So they're taking shelter underneath the boat. And moment by moment, they feel the sand grow colder. In other words, a shift in the weather. And the air becoming more damp and chill. And then the first raindrops sounded on the hull above the person's head because they're underneath the boat for shelter. So that is the paraphrase of the poem, putting it in our own words. And if we were to read this poem in the way that it's scanned, you will see that it has a particular pattern. And I'm going to try to read it in the pattern that it has. Breeze sent a wrinkling darkness across the bay. I knelt beneath an upturned boat, and moment by moment felt the sand at my feet grow colder, the damp air chilled and spread. Then the first raindrop sounded on the hull above my head. And if you can make an argument as to why that meter or beat is there, then you should certainly do so. And you can make an argument as to why that beat is there, because that beat is mimicking the sounds of raindrops. And notice how the poem starts more slowly, present a wrinkling darkness. And then it picks up towards the ending of the poem. Then the first raindrop sounded on the hull above my head. As the rain is getting faster, remember, the person is underneath the hull of the boat, so they're listening to the rainfall falling on the hull of the boat. So now that we've been able to make some sort of a connection between what's happening in the poem and its meter, in this instance the beat, it's almost what a drum provides when you're listening to a song, then you can talk about the scanning of the poem and how it's important. Another poem that they give you that's been scanned, Upon Julia's Clothes. This is on page 777 of the text that I had ordered. And this poem has been scanned for specifically rhyme. So in order to be able to determine the rhyme in something, in a poem, what you do is you look at the last word of each line. And then ultimately you identify each of those words with letters of the alphabet. So the first word at the ending of the first line is identified, or I should say the last word at the ending of the first line is identified with an A. And any words that follow that end any of the lines following, it's also identified as an A. And then when you've got a new rhyme at the ending of a line, well then that's going to be identified with the next letter in the alphabet, which is a B. You keep working your way down the alphabet. And then when you're done with the poem, you look to see if there's some sort of a pattern. And in this poem, which is very short, again, it's only 2 stanzas, and we know that a stanza is much like a paragraph. It's basically devoted to a particular topic, and then the authors decided to make a break. This poem was written in 1648 by Robert Herrick, Upon Julia's Clothes. And it reads, When as in silks my Julia goes, then methinks how sweetly flows that liquefaction of her clothes. Next, when I cast mine eyes and see that brave vibration each way free, oh, how that glittering taketh me. So if we were to look at the last words of each line, the first line ends with the word goes. That's identified with an A. Anything that rhymes with goes would be identified with an A. The next line ends with the word flows, which does rhyme with grows. So that's another A rhyme. And the third line ends with the word close. That's another word that rhymes with goes and flows. So it's identified with an A. Then we go to the next stanza and we see that that line ends with the word C. C does not rhyme with goes, flows, or close. So we use the next letter of the alphabet, B. We're starting a new rhyme. But we see that the next line ends with the word free. Free does rhyme with C. So that's another repetition, BB. And then lastly, C and free also rhyme with the last word of the last line, which is me. So what we've got is a pattern of AAA, BBB. And again, I say so what, unless you can relate it to the poem. And if we look at this poem, this is somebody who's talking about Julia. We assume this is a female who's wearing silk. And it's a very soft fabric. It's oftentimes associated with femininity, romance. And the second line reads, Then methinks how sweetly flows that liquefaction of her clothes. If you know anything at all about silk, it's very smooth and it does move almost like liquid. So that's the first stanza. Second stanza, next when I cast mine eyes and see, when I look, that brave vibration each way free, oh, that glittering taketh me. Now, it's not explicit. Part of it is because of the time period. But in the first stanza, Julia is wearing silk, likely a negligee. Second stanza, Julia is free of her silk. In other words, she's nude. She's disrobed at this point. And that's a brave vibration that's more glittering and more attractive. So this is a rather racy poem for 1648. But the rhyme works so well with the different states of being. Julia clothed is stage A. Julia unclothed or disrobed is stage B. use your imagination for stage C, which we're never given in the poem. So this is just an example of how you can scan poetry. And if you take a poetry class, you'll spend some more time scanning. I only mention it because I wanted you to be aware of it. And as you are reading the poetry, if you do see patterns in meter or rhyme and you scan it, then you need to be able to talk about how and why those patterns are important. Now, some of the poems that I've assigned to you are listed as handout in your syllabus. That means they are not included in the current edition of the text that I had ordered for class, but I do have links to find them in, and you can see that I've included them in the notes below. And as I indicated, I'm going to be including links whenever I can. And there was a poem that I wanted to read to you called Catch. And this is in the 4th section, our notes below. And it's a great example of how you can go about reading poetry. It's on page 596, and it's a poem about poetry and about how poetry is much like, well, a game of catch, which on the surface might not necessarily seem to have similarities, but they do. So this was written by Robert Francis in 1950. And it reads, Catch. Two boys uncoached are tossing a poem together. Overhand, underhand, backhand, sleight of hand, every hand. Teasing with attitudes, latitudes, interludes, altitudes. High, make him fly off the ground for it. Low, make him stoop. Make him scoop it up. Make him as almost as possible miss it. Fast, let him sting from it. Now, fool him slowly. Anything, everything. Tricky, risky, nonchalant, anything under the sun to outwit the prosy. Over the tree and the long sweet cadence down, over his head, make him scramble to pick up the meaning. And now like a posy, a pretty one plump in his hands. There's a paraphrase here, that a poet's relationship to a reader is similar to a game of catch. The poem, like a ball, should be pitched in a variety of ways to challenge and create interest. Boredom and predictability must be avoided if the game is to be engaging and satisfying. So, in terms of the way that we could go through this poem is explicating it, looking at it word for word, line by line. We can do it chronologically from top to bottom. We could go from bottom to top, or we could just choose something in the middle. I'll start at the top where it says two boys and that they are uncoached. And I think all of that is so important in terms of our understanding. Two, because there's two people who usually play catch, but two people with poetry, the writer and the reader. Boys, in other words, children. In other words, you don't need to be an adult, and they are uncoached. That means they can participate in the game of catch or in reading and writing poetry without necessarily any kind of instruction, though, of course, they would get better with instruction. And boys, at the time period of this poem, 1950, catch would have been, I think, associated with boys. Even today, think about baseball, which is basically male-centric. Or also think about the idea of reading and writing poetry in 1950 would probably be for those who were reading it from an academic perspective and those who were writing it professionally, probably male. So two boys uncoached are tossing a poem together. Overhand, underhand, backhand, sleight of hand, every hand. We've got the repetition of hand. Hands are so important with playing a game. Hands are so important with writing poetry or even reading it because you're supposed to annotate and take notes. Poetry's like a game of catch. It could be hard or easy. It could be a workout. You definitely want to try, if you are playing a game of catch, to make it not too easy, so that there's a challenge there. And sometimes it can be frustrating. All of those things I think are true of writing and reading poetry as well. And we're talked about how it teases. I think poetry teases because it doesn't give you specific meaning. Think about throwing a ball. You're not going to throw it straight. You're going to try to throw a curveball, for instance, if you're a pitcher. Lots of repetition, attitudes, latitudes, interludes, altitudes. High, make him fly off the ground for it. Low, make him stoop. In other words, you're going to have a workout here. Make him scoop it up, make him as almost as possible miss it. So in other words, you're trying to outwit, you're trying to deceive the reader when you're writing poetry. Much like you are trying to throw the ball in a way that it can't be caught when you're playing a game of catch. Fast, let him sting from it. Now, fool him slowly. Maybe that's what poetry is, something that tries to fool you. Anything, everything. Maybe that's what poetry is. Tricky, risky, nonchalant. Anything under the sun to outwit the prosy. And I think you will see there is an attempt in the poetry to try to outwit. Over the tree in the long, sweet cadence down. The cadence is a sound, and I can tell you that certainly poetry is musical and makes sound, but so does a ball when it's flying in the air, can whistle through the air. Over his head, make him scramble to pick up the meaning. So you are going to have to scramble, perhaps more so than what you've done with some of the other genres. And now, like a posy, a pretty one plump in his hands. Notice that alliteration of the repetition of the P sound. Posy, pretty, plump. And that also is the P sound for poetry. So, and also pitch. So, which is what you do when you are trying to catch. So, I use that poem as an example of some of the ways that you can explicate, giving a very detailed analysis of poetry. And as you know, poetry can be formulaic. It can be written for mostly entertainment or profit. And not that there's anything wrong with that. Or it has more depth and sophistication. And the textbook has talked about this with fiction, when it talked about the Harlequin romance and a sorrowful woman. And it talked about this with drama when it talked about television shows and how there is nothing wrong with them, and some of them can be quite sophisticated, but that, they probably don't have the level of sophistication as something that would be written to be performed on stage that would actually encourage us to read, because reading it is just as satisfying, maybe even more so, than watching it on stage, because there's so many literary elements associated with it. Same with poetry. If people still give each other greeting cards, then perhaps you are familiar with poetry on greeting cards. Or perhaps you are also familiar with songs. And again, some songs are written purely for entertainment and profit. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but some songs have more depth, so one of the things they do is they compare and contrast two poems. Luckily, I was able to find a link for them, both about love. And this is in the 7th section in the notes below. The Magic of Love and Love poem. And while both of these are about love, one is very formulaic and trite, and the other has much more depth and complexity. And I was able to find one of them online, love poem. I wasn't able to find Magic of Love, unfortunately, online, but I can read it to you. Magic of Love, written by Helen Ferries, date unknown. There's a wonderful gift that can give you a lift. It's a blessing from heaven above. It can comfort and bless. It can bring happiness. It's the wonderful magic of love. Like a star in the night, it can keep your faith bright. Like the sun, it can warm your hearts too. It's a gift you can give every day that you live, and when given, it comes back to you. When love lights the way, there is joy in the day, and all troubles are lighter to bear. Love is gentle and kind, and through love you will find there's an answer to your every prayer. May it never depart from your two loving hearts. May you treasure this gift from above. You will find if you do, all your dreams will come true, in the wonderful magic of love. It's very sing-songy. It does have a beat. It does have rhyme, but there isn't a whole lot of depth or complexity there. It's very generic, very general. It doesn't seem like it's written to a specific person. Part of what you might perhaps find on a greeting card, which is fine, because you're not supposed to think a lot when you're reading a greeting card. You don't need to reread it. You don't need to look up words, or at least you shouldn't need to. And that's fine for what it is, but it's probably not worth a lot of our time to discuss, as opposed to another poem also about love that has a lot more depth and complexity, written by John Frederick Nims in 1947. And it reads, and the link is included in the notes below if you wanted to see it online. My clumsiest dear, whose hands shipwreck faces, at whose quick touch all glasses chip and ring, whose palms are bulls in china, burrs in linen, and have no cunning with any soft thing, except all ill at ease fidgeting people. The refugee uncertain at the door, you make it home. Deftly you steady the drunk clamoring on his undulant floor. Unpredictable dear, the taxi driver's terror, shrinking from far headlights, pale as a dime, yet leaping before red apoplectic streetcars, misfit in any space, never on time. A wrench in clocks in the solar system. Only with words and people in love you move at ease. In traffic of wit expertly maneuver and keep us all devotion at your knees. Forgetting your coffee spreading on our flannel, your lipstick grinning on our coat, so gaily in love's unbreakable heaven, our souls on glory of spilled bourbon float. Be with me, darling, early and late. Smash glasses. I will study rye music for your sake. For sure your hands drop wide and empty. All the toys of the world would break. I can just about guarantee you that you need multiple rereadings for this poem, unlike the poem I just read about the magic of love. And if you were to go through this poem stanza by stanza, you can see that it's a love poem, but yet there's references to things that you don't necessarily expect in a love poem. For instance, my clumsiest dear. And yes, we expect dear, that's a term of endearment, but clumsy? So that's not necessarily a compliment, especially when we're told that this person's hand shipwrecked vases. Doesn't just break them, but shipwrecks them. Catastrophe. And whose quick touch all glasses chip and ring. So they're always breaking glasses. Whose palms are bulls in china. So if you've ever heard of the expression of a bull in a china shop. In other words, this person is very awkward and very clumsy. Burrs in linen. And a burr happens to be one of those little plants with little sticky, prickly things that can catch onto clothing. So she's basically rough. And I'll tell you why I believe it's a she in a moment. And have no cunning when any soft thing. So that's the first stanza. The second stanza shows us a shift, except all ill at ease fidgeting people. The refugee, uncertain at the door. So this person's grace is with ill at ease people, with people who are awkward and uncomfortable socially. The refugee, uncertain at the door. Think about the word refugee. It means someone who's homeless. Deftly you steady the drunk clamoring on his undulant floor. You know how difficult that is when there's somebody who's had too much to drink and you have to get them gracefully home. Unpredictable dear. So this is the next stanza, and dear is a term of endearment, but unpredictable isn't necessarily a compliment. The taxi driver's terror. And the stereotype at the time was that taxi drivers were crazy drivers. So how bad of a driver would this person need to be the taxi driver's terror? Shrinking from far headlights, pale as a dime. In other words, this person is a bad driver. They're afraid to make a left turn. They shrink from headlights that are so far away that they're pale as a dime, so they're afraid to make that left. Yet leaping before red apoplectic streetcars, they go when it's unsafe. And it looks like there's going to be an accident. For instance, crossing the train tracks when the train is coming. A misfit in any space and never on time. A wrench in clocks and solar systems. So this person basically negatively impacts the space-time continuum. Only, and now in this stanza, which is the fourth stanza, we see the combination of the negative, the clumsy, the bad driving, and the positive, the social graces that she has. Only with words and people in love you move at ease. In a traffic of wit expertly maneuver. I love that term because we were just talking about this person being a bad driver. But conversation is much like driving. It's something that some people do well and some people do poorly. It's sometimes stop and go. Sometimes you can have an accident. Sometimes you can be stalled. You know, the parallels continue. Keep us all devotion at your knees, that they are so devoted and in love with this person that they're willing to kneel before her. Forgetting your coffee spreading on our flannel. This is a person that's constantly spilling food and drink. Your lipstick grinning on our coat, leaving behind makeup. And considering the time period this poem was written, 1941, my assumption is that the subject of the poem is a female, even though, of course, both males and females can wear lipstick, but it would be much more likely in 1947 that it would be a woman. So Galen loves unbreakable heaven, that this person is constantly breaking things, but not relationships. Our souls on glory of spilt bourbon float, that they rejoice when something is spilled or broken because they know that that means the person's nearby. And then the last stanza, be with me, darling, early and late. It doesn't matter if you're early or late. Smash glasses. I'll study rhyme music for your sake. That sound of broken glass is musical. For should your hands drop white and empty, in other words, if you were to die, all the toys of the world would break. I love that line. Imagine if all the toys, all the things that are associated with fun and youth and hope and optimism, were to break at the same time. This is a love poem of realism, and it talks about the person's negative qualities and talks about how they are overshadowed by the person's positive qualities. So this gives you an idea, again, of the distinction between something that's pretty formulaic, the wonderful magic of love, as opposed to love poem. So I'm going to leave you with two songs, actually. The Sound of Silence. You might be familiar with this song by Simon and Garfunkel. It was a very famous song, and I have the link of Simon and Garfunkel in a reunion singing this song. And I also have a link of a cover of this song. Now, this is pretty dangerous, doing a cover of such an iconic song, such as the Sounds of Silence. And I can tell you that the Sound of Silence is an incredibly poetic piece. But poetry is about interpretation. If you've ever gone to a poetry reading, which I encourage you to do, it's almost like going to a concert. Different people can sing it different ways. So I'm curious to know what you think about the cover of The Sound of Silence. So I'm going to ask you to listen to both, and that'll be your attendance question for today. What did you think of that cover by Disturbed? Did you like it? Did you not like it? Did you prefer the Simon and Garfunkel? And that will prepare us for our next class where we get into the actual poetry itself, where I'm also hopeful at this point that you are doing some serious thinking about paper number 2, which we will also be discussing in further depth. As you know, we are talking about drama. So whether it be Oedipus, it be Midsummer, or it be Raisin in the Sun, whether it be performance or text. So I will leave you with listening to The Sound of Silence, and I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.